This is what leads us to the first class of the tetrapods. And these can be said to be the first vertebrates that really made use of land. There are still a number of amphibians with us today. Their larvae tend to be aquatic, but almost all of these animals as adults are terrestrial. They include things like salamanders as well as frogs and toads. But they are not completely free of the water. All of them require moist environments, at least during reproduction. The life cycle of an amphibian generally looks something like this, and this is something you're probably very familiar with. Obviously frogs and eggs and tadpoles, that's certainly something that I grew up being fascinated by and playing with. The real thing that, the way in which amphibians are most tied to the water involves their reproduction, and it's because the eggs dry out easily. So they have to be laid in the water, or at least in a very, very damp place. Fertilization is usually external. That means that the female extrudes the eggs. The male ejects sperm over the eggs when they're outside of the female's body. As larvae, many or most amphibians have gills suitable for breathing underwater, but as adults, they switch over to using lungs to breathe, or they breathe through their skin. The circulatory system of the amphibians is a little bit different than the circulatory system that we see in the bony fishes. What's evolved here is a three-chambered heart. The blood moves to the first chamber of the heart and is then pumped out through a vessel that splits, with half of the blood going to the lungs and the other half going to the body. This has, in other words, two circuits. The first circuit goes through the lungs, the pulmonary circuit. The second, the systemic circuit, takes blood to the body. It has probably occurred to you, just looking at this diagram, that this is not a very efficient way of doing things. The reason is that there is just one ventricle, and the blood that is coming back from the body and has no oxygen is mixing with the blood that is coming back from the lungs that has lots of oxygen. So the blood that actually goes to the body is only half oxygenated. This is not a great system. Reproduction, as we've seen with the plants, poses a real hurdle for organisms that are living on land, completely free of water. And the reason is that the membrane of the egg cell has to be open to the environment if it's going to be open to a sperm. In the amphibians, of course, then, external fertilization has to occur in water. The key innovation among the reptiles was that the water in which fertilization has to happen, does not have to be outside of the animal's body. If fertilization can happen in a wet environment within an animal's body, then the developing embryo can be sealed inside a watertight shell and then placed on land. This is a tough challenge, though, because in order for the embryo to not dry out after it leaves the mother's body, it has to be basically in an enclosed, self-sustaining environment. You can't get nutrients in through the eggshell, you can't get waste out through the eggshell. How do you deal with the exchange of gases if the embryo is locked up in a container that keeps it from losing water? This is one of the most complicated adaptations in really any of the animals that I know of, and it's called the amniotic egg. This is an adaptation seen only in the reptiles and the mammals today, and it completely freed these animals from needing water to reproduce. The first innovation in this whole set, really, of new features was this watertight egg shell. The shell of reptile eggs, or mammal eggs if you can find them, does not allow water to pass through it, but it does allow gas exchange. So the egg can very slowly take up oxygen and release carbon dioxide as the embryo is growing and metabolizing. Within that egg, there is a membrane, basically a sac bounded by a membrane, that contains food. That's a yolk sac. That's the yolk of an egg that you see when you break an egg open. And slowly as it develops, what happens is that the embryonic reptile, or in some cases mammal, absorbs that yolk and uses it to grow. Other membranes serve other functions. There is basically a waste sac, kind of the opposite of the yolk sac. This is where all the waste goes, and it's just stored there until the egg hatches. Another membrane involved in gas exchange, and the amnion, the membrane for which the amniotic egg is named, is something like a big airbag that cushions the developing embryo inside its home. The evolution of the amniotic egg means that fertilization must be internal within the amniotes, because sperm and egg must meet before the eggshell is made and sealed, and then before the egg is laid into the external world. The reptiles are the earliest group of organisms that had the amniotic egg. They also have other adaptations that allow them to survive away from water. In particular, their bodies are covered with scales that contain keratin. Keratin is the same stuff that's found in your fingernails and your hair, and in reptile scales it generates this layer that is extremely resistant to water loss. There's been a shift entirely away from gills of any kind or from the skin for respiration. Instead, all respiration in the reptiles is done within these high surface area chambers within the body. Those are, of course, lungs. And the lungs and circulatory system of reptiles are more efficient than those of amphibians. There's actually this sequence, this evolutionary sequence of different forms of the circulatory system within different groups of reptiles that we see today. So, for example, like an amphibian, turtles have a three-chambered heart in which there is some mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. But unlike the amphibians, there is a septum, a sheet of tissue right here, that partly divides the ventricle in half. What this means is that it reduces the mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So you get a little bit more separation between the oxygen-poor blood coming back from the body and the oxygen-rich blood, which needs to be moved next to the body. And that increases the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to the body's tissues. Lizards have a similar kind of heart. The ventricle is partly divided by a septum. Things get a little more complicated with the plumbing up top here. But you've got the same idea. The partial septum does a much better job of making an efficient circulatory system. And when you get up to the crocodilians, finally, what you have is a true four-chambered heart. The ventricle is fully separated by a sheet of tissue, and now you essentially have two pulsatile organs. One that takes blood from the body and sends it onto the lungs, and another, which just happens to be attached to it, that takes the blood that comes back from the lungs and sends it out to the body again. It's worth mentioning that birds are reptiles. Birds share these same characteristics that we've been talking about with respect to the reptiles, particularly these new modifications to the heart, the keratinized scales, and a number of other more esoteric structural features. Birds are often dealt with separately in, say, zoology textbooks and just in general parlance, because they have evolved a way of life that is really distinct from the other reptiles. And this involves such dramatic innovations that they're really different ecologically from the other classes of reptiles that we see today. Birds are incredibly diverse. They're more diverse than any group of vertebrates except for the bony fishes. There are about 9,000 species of them. And they share basically one thing in common that has radically modified their bodies in lots and lots of different ways. They're modified for flight. Even the few flightless birds that we see today had ancestors that flew, and so their bodies bear the imprint of the evolutionary history of having evolved to be a flying animal. One of the most important innovations for the birds was, of course, feathers. Feathers are scales. They evolve, or they develop in a very similar way to the scales, the keratin scales of reptiles. They are made of keratin. It's just that they have been structured in a very different way so that they are much, much better at trapping air. What they consist of is, if you look at a feather through a microscope, you can see these barbules that go off from the different veins, essentially, they look like veins on a feather, and they hook together so that you have this incredibly light structure that is nonetheless very, very good at trapping the air. This perhaps evolved first for insulation, because it is very likely that many dinosaurs were in fact actually warm-blooded, that is, they were homeotherms, and so they probably evolved these derived scales to keep body heat in. But of course, a structure that is good at trapping air in to keep heat in close to the body can also be used to trap air and soar or fly. Almost every other feature on a bird has been modified in some way to make it weigh less or in some way be suitable for flight. And in particular, there are dozens of modifications to the skeleton that you can see if you start studying, say, a bird skeleton and a skeleton of some other animal, like, say, a frog or a lizard or a mammal. If you put them side by side and start looking at all the differences between them, it's actually really easy to see how dramatically a bird skeleton has been modified for flight. The most notable way is that bird bones are hollow. They contain, rather than solid bone, they contain these very light struts, which maximize the strength that the bone has per unit weight. Birds have beaks rather than heavy teeth. In many cases, the air sacs of the lungs actually extend into the bones, further reducing their weight. There are a lot of ways in which the bones have become reduced and fused together so that the skeleton has the maximum possible strength at the minimum possible weight. There are many different ways in which the weight has been redistributed in the body to add stability during flight, and so on and so on. You can see here one final evolutionary adaptation for flight is this tremendous breast bone called a keel. That is where flight muscles are attached. These animals move in a radically different way than other tetrapods, and when you look at their skeletons, you see it reflected in basically every detail of those skeletons. One of the things that's perhaps most nifty about the birds is that they have a much more sensible lung, really, than we do. It's very complicated. It's this tremendous set of sacs and passages. But what it ends up achieving is that it moves air through the lung in a circular fashion. We spend basically a lot of the air that goes down into our lungs every time that we breathe in is air that we didn't quite just manage to breathe out. A lot of dead air gets trapped in our lungs and only partly pushed out every time we exhale. So we don't actually get completely fresh air in our lungs every time we breathe in. Birds do, because what they're doing is they're passing air first to some air sacs toward the back of the body, and then that air is pushed forward through the actual lung. This is completely fresh air. And when it passes forward through the lung, the bird can take as much oxygen as possible out of it, particularly because it's taking advantage of countercurrent flow. Then that air enters an air sac toward the front of the animal's body, and the next time it breathes out, that air is pushed out of the body. Again, for the same reason as the fish gills, this means that birds get a lot more oxygen out of every breath than, say, you or I do. And it allows them to sustain a tremendously high level of exertion that's necessary to keep a relatively large animal off the ground. Of course, one adaptation without which birds would never be able to get off the ground is that they have regulated their body temperature. They are homeothermic. And in fact, their bodies stay a little bit warmer than ours at homeostasis. This is extremely costly in terms of energy. Birds and mammals waste a vast majority of the energy that they actually take in. But it allows them to be more active. And in birds, of course, that makes all the difference. If you're not more active than, say, your average snake or turtle, you are not going to be able to fly. In addition, being able to regulate your body temperature means that you can stay active in locations or at times when it's too cold for a cold-blooded animal, an animal that is a thermoconformer, to continue functioning.